Before we start our program today, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor. Special thanks to Common Ground Health for being our presenting sponsor for this month's presentation. We are also pleased to be co-hosting this event with Hinge Neighbors and C4. I want to thank them and Highland Planning for the support of this Placemaking 101 program. Also, like to acknowledge Monica Reifenstein, who is the office coordinator for the Community Design Center, who is making everything work behind the scenes. And so now I'd like to welcome back our panelists. Jim McIntosh is principal of Bergmann Associates, where he focuses on infrastructure projects, including water quality, municipal roadways, and neighborhood development. McIntosh has more than 3 decades of civil engineering experience and previously served as a city engineer in the Bureau of Architecture and Engineering at the City of Rochester. Welcome back, Jim. Erik is the manager of special projects for the City of Rochester's Department of Environmental Services, Bureau of Architecture and Engineering. He is currently responsible for coordination of the Rock the Riverway Initiative and the Inner Loop North Transformation. And Norman Garrick is Professor of Transportation and Urban Planning at the University of Connecticut. Professor Garrett has authored chapters in many books, including the International Handbook on Transportation and Development, and has had his research published in such places as the Journal of Transport and Health. So welcome back, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us again today. Well, we had a really wonderful presentation and started a very engaged discussion about the Inner Loop North project. And one of the things that struck me was Norm's comment about approaching this project from a placemaking standpoint versus the standpoint of designing the actual aspects of the project, the road width, what it's bordered by, what the uses might be, the land uses. So what does that mean, Norm, to look at the community from this holistic point of view?
Well, I think if you approach it from a transportation point of view, the focus in transportation in the US is on moving things, and particularly moving vehicular traffic. And if that's the focus, then you will get a totally different set of solutions than if you think about how is this project going to develop a community, develop a resilient community, develop a sustainable community. If that's your starting place, then you start to look at different types of solutions that addresses those needs first and foremost, and not the need for moving traffic as the preeminent goal.
It kind of goes along with, you know, you kind of see what you're looking for, right?
Exactly.
This concept that if you're looking at solving the traffic issue, that's the kind of solution you're going to get.
Definitely. And in fact, why we are in the mess we are trying to deal with now is because the goals in the 1950s and 1960s, the goal was to move traffic, was to make cities like Rochester a vehicle machine, a machine for cars.
So when we talk about the Inner Loop East project, which is, in my opinion, a very, very successful project, the differences between the Inner Loop East project and the Inner Loop North project are distinct. For one, the Inner Loop North project has well-established neighborhoods that are on both sides of the current roadway. And so the need to blend these neighborhoods together, to use the infill as a way to build this new community of sorts, whether it's newer or meshing together aspects of what's already there. So how can we use placemaking to accomplish that? I know that we're starting to look at placemaking as another metric to build communities. So can any of you respond to that?
Well, you know, I guess one thing I'll note is, you know, so the funding is administered by the Department of Transportation. So, you know, the people that are behind this have a transportation mindset. And so one of the things that we learned with Interloop East is that, you know, these projects are not necessarily transportation projects. As Professor Garrick indicated, they really are, they're community projects. And so that Interloop East, that was advanced, not ultimately was signed off on by the State Department of Transportation, not as a transportation project, but as a community development or economic development project. Ultimately, however, the powers that be authorize and approve these sort of projects is fine by me, you know, so long as we ultimately achieve the goals that we've set out. So, so in looking at Interloop North, you know, maybe we're not building a new, and I don't know, there's no presupposed outcome here, so I'm trying to be careful with what I say. Because, you know, I don't want to say we're definitely removing the highway, or we're definitely building a new street, or we're definitely not building a new street. Who knows? There's many concepts and possibilities for what could be as a result of the project. But certainly the public engagement aspect of this is critical in understanding both the historic impacts of the construction of this facility, what it meant for people who lived there at the time and who were displaced, but also people who live there today, and making sure that history does not repeat itself, that we don't cause unanticipated consequences on those who live there today, whether on either side of you know, whichever neighborhoods that people live in, and making sure that, you know, whatever succeeds the current situation out there, whatever is done to change things, that it's adding to rather than taking away from what exists today. So, for instance, if there's a recognized dearth of active and passive recreation areas, well, then is this project an opportunity to provide some of those, and where do those go in a way that residents who already live in these areas have easy access to them and work with the flow of the community. That would just be one example.
Great. Well, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit, and you know, there's so much we've learned through the pandemic about our communities. There's so many trends that we've you know, developed as a result of the past development, the way development has occurred in the past. So we're definitely seem to be at a turning point here, where we're starting to look at options more favorably. So I wanted to ask Dr. Garrick, what do you think American cities can learn from some of the European case studies that you show where they are successfully undid automobile streets? How can we bring this conversation to American municipalities and policies that may still be planning around the automobile? So we seem to be at this unique place in history where we're starting to look at maybe the streets don't have to be just for cars. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that we get what we build, we get what we plan for. And I think, you know, a lot of Americans go to European cities and they see in some places a very kind of community, people-friendly environment. And they think that that is because the Europeans are different. And the truth of the matter is that there are as many non-people-friendly cities in Europe as almost as much as in the US. The specific ones that people like to point to, like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, are places where people made a conscious decision 40, 50 years ago, and they kept with it. And there are always these automobile-oriented folks that are pushing back, but there's a constant push in the other direction. So it's not that American cities are different in some fundamental way. There are American cities that have also gone down that same track. If we look at Portland in the news all the time now, but Portland has changed the culture. They started in the 70s, Cambridge, Mass., Burlington, Vermont, and other places that are just beginning to start, like Minneapolis and St. Paul and Salt Lake City. It's about being clear about what type of city and stick to that, to those goals and to those ideals. European cities are not fundamentally different. Europeans are not fundamentally different. Maybe only to the extent that people have been able to push back in those cities that have succeeded, push back successfully. I think Rochester, I posted the article I wrote about Rochester again on my LinkedIn. And one of the comments was that this is a miracle. So people are looking to Rochester as a model, and maybe they'll be starting to talk about you as they do about European cities going forward.
Thank you, Norman, for making that point. It is important to note how significant this project was when it was proposed, when the first section was done, and now as we move on to improving upon it with this extension, it'll be really quite interesting to see how it evolves. Gentlemen, do you have any comments regarding this shift in culture from car-driven society to maybe a more acceptance of other transit modes, or the desire to have other transit modes?
I think this kind of gets back to what Erik kind of ended up with in the last talk about, we, the citizens of Rochester, and the people, who are interested in this project, have to make a decision about what kind of city, we're looking to have. And, this project is an opportunity much more than Interloop East, which, we had talked about previously, didn't have an existing street grid to connect on either side. A lot of that had been taken away in the area towards downtown. But here we do have, a chance to do that, and maybe even improve upon, what was there. So I think, and I agree with Norm, I love Europe, and I've been to a couple of those cities he's talked about. But there are other cities there that are just full of cars and expressways. And I think, maybe the difference there is that in the areas that have, a lot of tourism, they tend to do that just to promote the tourism, have walking streets and those kind of things. And then once that happens, the people who live there realize, hey, this would be cool for the rest of the city. They do it in a little section, and then they, then it kind of takes over. And I think, that's kind of the impetus, we need here is, we're, trying it now on Gibbs Street, in some of these places as a response to, trying to let people be able to eat out on the street. And I think the attitudes may be changing as far as, does every street need to be driven down?
I know that so many comments related to the fact that how will removing this, this fast route impact the neighboring, the neighboring streets? How do we keep that funneled traffic from going through the neighborhood? And I think Norman had a great point in talking about how cities originally developed. They had a street grid that would give people options so that that traffic could dissipate. And so I know that there's a tremendous amount of concern about that, because people typically say, we don't want to have all those other cars come through our neighborhood. But is that really a huge concern if we're able to maintain through the road designs or the design of the spaces all over the neighborhood, a way to control the speed? So the distinction between traffic versus, the speed of traffic. Do you see that as a real concern of people, if they don't have this fast route, spilling out through the neighborhood streets and drag racing down the side roads?
Well, this is a really difficult issue to deal with, because, as I mentioned last week, engineers and planners are not really trained to design gridded systems like they were 150 years ago. They didn't have the skills. They don't have the skills like designers had 100 years ago, 150 years ago. If you look at the east end of Rochester, you can see how the streets were designed as main streets, as commercial main streets, and some streets were designed as quiet residential streets. And you can see how effectively that works. It's all about how you design the network, how you design the street cross-section, and how those two things come together. And I think we can apply some of the same concepts that we see in other parts of Rochester to this new project, and it will work effectively to bring traffic where you want, because you do want traffic on the commercial streets, and to lessen traffic on the streets that need to be quiet for living, for kids playing in the streets.
This plays to a point that you made earlier about the need to recreate Main Street as it was originally intended. The fact that urban main streets have somewhat lost their character as this kind of center of the community. And you had a comment regarding that, Norm.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure out, even after being on the ground in Rochester, it took me a while to figure out that Main Street was so significant in the past as the axis around which everything revolved, basically, in downtown Rochester. The way that the inner loop destroyed parts of the grid changed the relationship of the city to Main Street. So, for example, that intersection of University and Main Street, it must have been a really important point in the city. It must have been one of the most important and significant square in the city, and that is now does not read in that way anymore because of changes to the grid. So I think trying to bring back some of those elements would help the city as a whole.
Well, we have a few questions from our participants, so I'd like to ask Suzanne Mayer, if you would let me unmute you, or I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
I think it worked.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming back and doing this. I think that one thing that when we talk to a lot of the neighbors, they will say, I want to be able to reach my destination in so many minutes. RTS has said we want to make sure the buses can cross the city in so many minutes. And they say that each time, if we don't have the inner loop, we add 7 minutes to everybody's travel time. We think 7 minutes would be a good idea because then you can enjoy what's on your route as opposed to flying by and not seeing anything. So can you talk a little bit about that, perhaps Jim and Erik, about how that could be done? And the question, there's a lot of fear in how much traffic would actually go onto different streets. Would we have Delavan become a two-way street? How would Lyndhurst become a two-way street? Because we have a huge amount of one-way streets in this area. And how does that have to be changed in order to absorb all the traffic that would come off of this inner loop area? Am I trying to be, I don't know if I'm clear enough, but.
Very clear.
Sure. Well, I can't answer the question about how streets would be set up without first knowing what alternatives are going to be ultimately recommended, and then what alternative is ultimately chosen as preferred. And a lot of that, of course, will be based on input and the desires of the community that these locations are within. So what I would note, though, and again, it's been said already, is that we can't make all of our decisions for a project like this based on estimated traffic volumes, and that examples not only from Rochester but from cities all over that have done similar sort of work indicates that traffic finds another way, or just simply gets absorbed into the grid, and you don't even notice a significant change in traffic. So of course we're going to be looking at that. Again, this is the Inner Loop is a state DOT owned, operated, and maintained facility, and they are at the table with us, and they will expect that we're going to look at both local and regional traffic impacts of whatever alternatives are proposed. But I would say that the decisions that are made can't be based purely on traffic, but have to be based on what the impacts are for the city as a whole. What city do we want to be going forward? And hopefully, as we get into those questions, as we get into what those alternatives are that we're considering, that we honor the hard work that was done throughout the community by community members, not just city staff, but hundreds and thousands of community members through the through the Rochester 2034 Comprehensive Plan update, which very clearly states what our goals are as a city.
And I guess, you know, I would challenge the 7-minute delay or whatever was discussed. And I think Erik will also remember we did a study when we did the two-way conversion for Clinton, St. Paul, and South Avenue to show that you could turn both of those roads back to two-way all the way from the South Wedge, which you can always get there but can't get back on the same road. But in proving that, they did an analysis of what the time difference would be to go to the, you know, northern connection at the inner loop and the southern connection through the city, and what additional time that would be. And it was something under a minute if you know, made that road two-way roads instead of, you know, one-way roads. So I think, you know, that thought process, you know, just hasn't, you know, just didn't bear out even in that study, which was done by traffic engineers.
So I'm just wondering, is there a way that we need to help in educating or getting more of that talked about, like with our citizenship or anybody who's assuming those things? The greatest part, the harm that we have is people assuming what's going to happen, and then they make their own decisions about a wrong decision. So how do you make specific things that you say, we ought to talk about this? Like, that's the purpose of this particular webinar, is to start talking about what are these issues and how can we work through them. So we're interested in how do we raise those issues and who do we talk to?
But I think, Suzanne, I think raising the issue of the one-way street system, for example, is one way of starting to break down these barriers, because you have to, there are lots of myths and lots of misinformation in transportation engineering that goes back to the professionals, but that is absorbed by the general public because it seems commonsensical. It seems commonsensical that you would be able to travel faster across city if you have a freeway. But then that is not dealing with things like the fact that you have concentration of traffic, etc. And then once you get off the freeway, how do you deal with getting the traffic to its actual destination? So I really think it's the point you raised about this one-way street system is one of the kinds of conversation that you're going to have over the course of time, and trying to understand the implications of those small, what seemingly small design decisions that were made 50 years ago. And something like as simple as this one-way system, that's a huge topic of discussion that a lot of cities are now addressing. For example, South Bend, I believe it's South Bend, Indiana, just changed the downtown from one-way to two-way. So there are examples in other places that you can learn from, but it requires getting people to talk about their fears and these myths that we have about transportation.
I agree, Norman. I know that we had a really great conversation about this in our post presentation summary, where we talked a little bit about that time difference and the fact that people expect it to be so much more, but in reality, it's proven to be less, of course, depending on where you're going. And this speaks to that first mile, last mile dilemma, where we've used the expressway to connect places as a quick connection, but then we kind of extended that theory to how do we get to that connection point and how do we get from that connection point to where we want to go. And I think that might be where we've kind of failed to say, you know, you need to get off the expressway and go into the neighborhood and behave differently as you go through the community. And it is flexible and it is fast because you can choose a variety of routes to get to where you need to go. So that's certainly something that the Community Design Center can look at as a potential topic for discussion in the future. So thank you, Suzanne, for that. And to Erik's point, and relative to the same question, I know that when we're designing places, we have to make some assumptions. And so as the Inner Loop East was being designed, there were there were decisions made about how much traffic would be served, and how has that proven to be in reality? I know that we've made assumptions that we need to design for so much traffic, and yet maybe people have found other ways to get around or have chosen different routes. And did that actually turn out to be close to your assumptions, or where did you see any differences?
I don't know that I've actually seen an actual vehicular count since the project took place. I'm looking now for the bicycle and pedestrian counts, though, that have been done in 2018 and 2019 compared with 2014 before construction began. And we have seen as a whole, and granted this will fluctuate. We don't have the 2020 numbers yet. And obviously COVID's going to change that, but we're looking at a 67% increase in the number of bikes in the project area, and that's based on nearly a dozen different count locations. So it's not just one particular location, but 2/3 increase between 2014 and 2019 in bikes, and a nearly 50% increase in pedestrians, which indicates that just simply because none of that development really had been completed prior to the counts being done in 2019, that just by removing this expressway and reconnecting streets and getting rid of that psychological barrier that exists with having to cross the expressway, not to mention the wider sidewalks and the high quality bike facility that provided have already led to a significant increase in the amount of bicycle and pedestrian traffic in that area. So I think we'll get vehicular counts in the near future, and we'll see. I think everybody can probably go out and look and say it's not where the 20-year forecast was going to be, let alone who knows we'll see. But it's not where it was probably expected to be. But we'll see what happens when all the developments are in place. But I think looking at the bicycle pedestrian volumes gives you an indication that when these developments are fully open, you're going to see much more mode share, if I can use a technical term, being given to bikes and pedestrians rather than people, driving in and driving out and taking all their trips by car. So, as we build a mixed use urban community like this, it shouldn't be a surprise that people are going to live like they live in a mixed use urban community.
So the wonderful thing about this is we've taken what was just a slice through the earth that was this fast thoroughfare and created a new neighborhood, really. So that's really exciting. I want to ask Bob DiPaola to ask his question. He's been waiting for a while. Bob. Bob, do you need to unmute yourself?
Yes, there we go.
There you go.
Okay. I'm not that familiar with the Zoom stuff, but I have a number, after watching the presentation that you posted online, I thought it was really interesting, and I have some observations and some questions in no particular order. I guess, but first off, the first, I think, driving question is the outcome of this project already predetermined, and we're just window dressing? And I asked that for a couple of reasons, because on this broadcast today, I've heard one of you refer to the infill, we are infilling north, and Erik has said, there's no solution yet. Yet, for the last year and a half, I've heard a lot of public officials say, when we fill in the inner loop, it sounds to me like this is predetermined.
No,
and if it's an open,
Bob,
if it's Erik, it's very refreshing to hear you say we don't have a solution yet.
Yeah, that's right. And as the city's project manager for this, I need to, although we're very happy with the success that we've had with Interloop East, and I think as a whole, we have a goal to achieve something similar with Interloop North. We do not have a presupposed outcome for this. We have many alternatives that need to be considered and will be considered as we go through this. If we knew what we wanted to do, or not even what we wanted to do, but what we could do and what we could achieve, then we wouldn't go through a planning and scoping exercise like this. So there are goals, and there are different goals depending on different different people that you talk to. But no, there is not a presupposed outcome at this time.
Okay. Well, then let me segue into something else. If the outcome is not predetermined, as you're saying it's not, we're discussing on today's broadcast either a traffic project or perhaps a housing project or multi-use project. But I don't believe that those are exclusive of one another. We have a huge investment in an existing facility that in other cities that is made multi-use. I mean, you have the road underneath, you have a building above, and that becomes an engineering problem. But those are solvable. So I don't think it should be an either-or kind of discussion. It should be a both discussion, because there's a lot of traffic. And granted, your traffic counts are estimated, but there's an awful lot of cars that use that every day. And to try and diffuse, to use Norm's language, to diffuse those into the neighborhoods is going to be a nightmare. And I say that because I live downtown, and about 3 years ago, the entrance ramp from State Street onto the inner loop going east was closed for maintenance work. So the traffic was rerouted onto Andrews and then University. And it became such a boondoggle. There were fights, there were backups miles long, and frustration. So to dump that kind of traffic onto the city grid right now is not so easy. And that concern that Suzanne mentioned earlier about dealing with the traffic. We have to deal with the traffic. We have to deal with creating more space for more housing. All that's possible. And I think I would ask to look at an alternative of building over the road, not removing the road, and building on the road. I mean, you drive into Boston on Route 90, what do you see? You go into a tunnel, there's a multi-story building above your head. This could work here, especially because the loop is already subgrade. It's below grade, so it's probably not the worst solution in the world. Another concern I have is that one of the developers on the Inner Loop East project has now decided he is not going to build his project because he states that there's no market for market rate housing. I think that void right now, which is just a vacant lot, it's got to be addressed in the future. If there's no market rate housing going to be built, what are we doing? What are we going to build there? Are we going to build more affordable or low income housing? And is that the right thing to do? I have I've written to the website with some questions. I've never received answers. So I would just ask if I have about 2 pages of comments. I would like to, rather than take up everyone's time, send them in, but I would like an answer. I would like some response. So, just by the way, School 58, I was the project manager for that project for 6 years through the planning and execution. We bought land from New York State DOT to stretch that school property out into the inner loop area. And it was a process, it was a good process. But when we spent $42 million on that project, there was never any concept of expanding the playing fields. It would be nice to do, but it was not doable. So if that school shouldn't be one of the reasons what we're doing this project and infilling, because it could be arranged. I mean, I think a solution could be found there too. So that's my perspective today. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I would encourage you to, our panelists all provide contact information. So I would encourage you to send your comments to all of us, and we'll be sure to have the appropriate agencies respond. But I appreciate your thoughts. So Erik, to recap, anything's on the table from keeping the highway to total removal. We're just at the stage of just trying to get community input and engage the different community stakeholders to provide feedback. Is that correct?
Yeah, generally speaking, we all options are on the table. That this is a project development process. This is the first step. It's the planning study phase. And we are looking to reposition the corridor. We know that it has separated neighborhoods and depressed property values and other things. And we've had success with Inner Loop East, and we're hoping to see what can we do with Inner Loop North. But to suggest that we have any firm idea of what's going to be. We don't. There's ideas. There's lots of ideas, and one of those ideas, just as Bob says, maybe it's a tunnel or decking over. Tunnels are very expensive, but decking over may be an option. So these are all things that can be considered as we go through that process. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I'm going to call on Brendan. Is it Brendan Thompson?
Brennan, yes. Hi, thank you.
Hi, Brendan.
So I'm a part of the Racial Equity Subcommittee of the Community Advisory Committee for the Interloop North project. And I just wondered specifically from Professor Erik or anyone on the panel, if there are any recommendations to how to center racial equity in a project like this, any strategies or just general recommendations, especially knowing the kind of the character of the history of this project.
Well, I think it starts with what are the goals for the project. And I was thinking this earlier, that equity needs to be the #1 goal of the project. It is dealing with historical harm that was done to the city that affected disproportionately African Americans and other racial minorities. And that needs to be at the top of the list of any goal for the project. I think that's how you center it, is to make it purposefully a #1 goal of the project.
If I could just follow up, are there any specific tools or resources or strategies that we as a subcommittee, I mean, it's a planning study, right, and a traffic planning study at that, but anything that we can do to elevate racial equity through, one of our initiatives is to create, or look to support a racial equity impact statement. I don't know if the subcommittee is going to be the entity to write that, but anything in the toolkit that you'd recommend that we as a subcommittee could lift up to the larger planning process.
Well, I think you're hit the nail on the head. I think you're starting at the right place. That statement of what the project is about is definitely the important starting place. But it needs to be also inclusive of not just the neighbors, but other people in the city to have a voice in what kind of project and what kind of neighborhood that is built there. And to make sure that any planning is not just about removal, but is about enhancing the neighborhood.
Thank you.
And I should also say that there are lots of groups around the country that are dealing with these kinds of issues. In fact, there was one group that I've been dealing with recently about a project of a smaller scale in Chicago. But there are groups like Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, who has lots of expertise in these areas, and I think reaching out to some of these people might be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Kind of following up on that question, we had a question from last week that goes, since part of the placement of the inner loop was consistent with the white middle class abandonment of much of the city after the Great Migration, affirmatively cutting off some of the neighborhoods from the downtown, how will the Inner Loop North project affirmatively consider this when most impacted neighbors are neighbors of color? So I guess it's a fundamental question of how important is this issue of racial and social equity and justice to the foundation of the design of this future neighborhood.
Maria, let me just jump in for a minute. Paul Tankel here. And I think it ties to what we're talking about, because last week when the question of like anchor institutions came up, and the train station was highlighted as the anchor institution. There's the institutions that are in the community north of the Inner Loop. The Jordan Health Center, Baden Field, Chatham Gardens, Flight Village. I mean, those, I don't know how involved folks from those institutions and those housing areas are involved in the discussion, but those are anchor institutions. At least that's what I would consider them to be anchor institutions. So I think as we're talking about equity or inequities, you know, those areas certainly need to be seen as anchor institutions.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. And one of the things when we were speaking privately was the fact that the actual neighborhood organizations on both sides of the inner loop are strong assets for the community. Really have to commend the city for putting together the committee that is quite expansive, very broad, that actually also has subcommittees. So I think the city is really doing a great job in at least trying to get engagement from the very beginning of this process. And so part of that is identifying those assets and then hopefully getting input from the various community stakeholders. So gentlemen, do you have any comments? All right then.
The only thing I'll note on that, and I believe we did talk about it a bit before, is, you know, starting with an acknowledgement of the trauma, the history of the development of this facility as a starting point, right? And to say that, you know, we recognize that decisions that were made back then had a significant impact on existing communities. And has a lasting impact for people that still live or were displaced from the project area. And as we, you know, have discussions with the Community Advisory Committee, and as the Racial Equity Subcommittee does its work, you know, to continue to inform the project team and serve as that sounding board as we develop this project, whatever the project ultimately will be, with that in mind, and so that we heal wounds, and we focus on not repeating mistakes from the past.
Thank you, Eric. I know that in many of the questions, the issue of green space or lack of green space has come up. One question was referencing retail space. So I think, again, because of the environment that we're currently living in, we've become much more aware of the assets that are available in our neighborhoods and what we are lacking. So being able to look at our neighborhoods holistically and try to identify those things and try to find a way to provide those for the people that live in the existing community would be a goal that I'm interested in achieving. We're getting close to our closing time here, and I do not see any other questions from the participants. So what I'd like to do is let you each make a closing comment regarding this project, this experience, whatever you'd like to say and whatever you'd like to share. So why don't we start with Erik, and we'll work our way around.
Putting me on the spot here. Well, let's see. You know, one, I of course I appreciate the opportunity to bring attention to this project. It's critically important. We're working on a number of things at the city that are about improving accessibility and correcting historic errors. And this project, of course, fits right into that. And there was I guess I did look through some of the questions that were proposed at the last meeting, and somebody had asked how do we possibly quantify benefits and costs for projects like these, and how do we ever get it to demonstrate that there's more benefits? And this isn't a big statement here, but I'll just note, if you are interested in how does one quantify benefits for a project of this nature, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different ways that the federal government recognizes. I'll just note that the key ones to consider for Interloop East were the life cycle maintenance costs. So taking out a expressway with, you know, all that asphalt, all of the drainage systems, all of the guide rails and overhead lighting and sign structures and walls and everything, versus replacing it with a, you know, generally standard city surface street. is a considerable share of the benefits obtained there. In fact, the benefits from that alone were enough to outweigh the costs of the project. Then you add on the safety benefits. So by taking out a high-speed expressway with multiple interchanges that are non-standard and whatever, you're reducing the number of injuries and potential injuries and property damage. I don't think there were any fatal crashes, but essentially also fatalities, and you know, those are obviously benefits as well. And then there's the land value increases both on existing land and the new development that can be obtained. So you bring that in, plus there's all kinds of other benefits which may or may not be able to be monetized for the purposes of that. But that's how ultimately you get to a benefit cost analysis. So I'll use my time to answer a question that I saw in there and thought others might have that same question. And we'll be doing the same sort of analysis with Interloop North.
Great. Jim?
Sure. I guess I'll follow up on Suzanne and Bob's, question about traffic. And I think a point that, we really need to think about, and this goes back to, people finding their way on the grid, is that people now, many people now, go down Main Street, take the right onto the Interloop because it's the fastest way to get to 490 East or West. Even if they're going 490 East, they're making a right, going around on the Interloop because they can go 52 or 55 without getting a ticket and get on the Interloop. If that option was gone to them, I think a lot of them would go down Union Street and get on the Interloop over by Eastman Savings and Loan, or they would, go down Main Street to head west and pick up 490 somewhere else. So I think, traffic is going to flow where it's easiest, and we've seen this happen when we've added, entrance ramps to expressways and, and stop them, as Bob talked about. But I also think that we would, just because that one entrance, which is a heavily used one on Main Street, goes away, that there isn't options for people and that they won't find another way to get to their destination. And I also think that the people in the neighborhoods, won't be penalized because of that increase in traffic. I think that, people are not going to go down, little side streets just to weave their way, back in the same direction. They will take the easiest route, which in this case, if you're going east, would now be Union Street as opposed to going around on, the current Interloop.
And I just wanted to say to both of those points, there is evidence that that we will try through the Design Center to research and share regarding the first mile, last mile, time delays, and land values, because all of these things, especially regarding land values, this is kind of becoming a really new hot career, the economy of space. So it is quantifiable, and we see what we can do to find some of that information and share it. And last but not least, I invite Professor Norm Garrick to speak.
Well, I think I'd take my time to try to clarify the relationship between placemaking, city making, and transportation. They're not two different things. They're fundamentally interrelated, but transportation is subordinate to city making. If you are making a city, you must have ways for people to get around. And those ways include walking, biking, private automobile, transit. How we have lost our way in some ways in American City is that we elevated transportation as if it was the end all and be all, and not just transportation. I really want to emphasize that point. It's not just transportation, it's about car transportation. And what I see us trying to do with this project, to redo with this project, is to restore the proper order of things, to think about what it is we need in the city, and then what type of transportation system is going to help to get us to our economic, our social, our environmental goals. Those are all more important than transportation. And car transportation is not the only way to get to those goals. We need to think about how the role that car transportation plays in supporting those goals. And so if we elevate car transportation above everything else, we get the distortions that we see now. And Rochester is a prime example of that. Rochester is probably at least 50% of the downtown devoted to car transportation. We need somehow to restore the balance, to change how we think about the city, to change what we want from the city. And it's not just getting from one place to the other as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Norm. And with that, I want to thank all of you for participating, for taking time and having this conversation. Please reach out through the community, through the CAC, through the social equity, racial equity subcommittee, through any of these agencies. If you want to get involved, if you have ideas or suggestions for other people to get involved, please share those. And so thank you to all of you for taking the time. Thank you especially to our panelists for coming back to visit us again. And we will continue to have these conversations throughout the coming year, throughout the coming years, I hope. So at this point, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We have major sponsors for our lecture series, all of our sponsors for the Community Design Center. I'd be remiss if I don't acknowledge them, as they are what make our work possible. I want to point out to you, please save the date for our next Placemaking 101 presentation, which is Moving Rochester Forward, featuring our very own planning team. So they're going to be sharing information of how we're going to help bring 2034 comp plan to reality, and that is September 9th at noon. Our next lecture series presentation is coming up at the end of September. It was rescheduled from March. We're looking forward to having Bernice Rattle visit us virtually. The time will be determined, but please save the date, and we will share information on our website and through our email. And again, the people left to thank besides our sponsors are, of course, our circle of friends, who are people that support our organization through a sustained financial support. If you value the work that we do, I invite you to consider joining our circle of friends. I'd like to thank our board of directors, especially our staff, and again, our speakers. Thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to having you join us again. And I got some great ideas about some of the topics that you would be interested in hearing more about, but please do not hesitate to reach out to me if there's anything that we can do to help facilitate more conversations or any engagement in the community. So thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.